Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked.
and sometimes what didn't,
You will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts.
And inspire you to do even greater things.
This episode of the Software People Stories features Cynthia Swarnalatha, Vice President Engineering, Software Center of Excellence, Compute Business Group, and HPE India Site Leader. Cynthia walks us through her career path of over 3 decades, from when and how she chose to study computer science, and bringing a give it my best attitude from the very beginning. She is a customer-first person and shares what it takes to keep the focus on understanding problems first and foremost, and then seeking the best solutions. She shares from her experience crucial aspects to manage organizational transformations and managing global teams, where she says, put the first step forward to know the other person. And as always, leaves listeners with a message for aspiring technologists and engineers. Listen on. Hi, Cynthia. Very warm welcome to you to the Software People Stories podcast. I've so been looking forward to this conversation. It's been quite a while that we've been trying to do this. So I'm really happy that we got the time and space to do it now. Very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Chitra. I'm really happy to be part of this. I know I've been evading this for a long time. So I'm happy we are able to make time for it.
We usually ask the guests who come on this podcast, to start by introducing us to your origin story. I know of you as an engineer and somebody who's worked in technology and engineering companies. But where did this all begin? How did you choose to become an engineer?
Yeah, I would say that goes back to my childhood. I used to love math and science in school. Those are the subjects where I really scored the highest. And that really got me interested. That when I finished my grade 10 and I wanted to select, that's when you really choose whether you want to do your medicine, engineering, or arts, or whatever. And my mom actually wanted me to be a doctor. In that interview, I remember I told the principal, I'm going to choose computer science because that was the first batch of computer science, I think, in school. And I was really scared of looking at all those big books that people study, people who wanted to become doctors. And I'm like, I don't think I'm cut out for that, and I always liked logic. For me, it was a natural choice that I preferred the logical sciences over biological sciences. That's when it started. I just enjoyed the journey. Obviously, those days it was, either you had to do mathematics or an engineering or a chartered accountancy or medicine. And engineering somehow seemed to be a natural choice. I wrote the engineering entrance examination, got a merit seat. I was the second batch of computer science from the university that I graduated from. I think I was privileged to be part of that batch. I think, having chosen computer science then, I have been in this industry for 3 decades now, and I've seen the ups and downs. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, Chitra.
3 decades and where it all started. I can't imagine, but here we all are. Many, many questions coming in my mind. You started out your career and you've practically worked, I think, in almost all aspects of and working on the engineering side in tech companies. What stands out as in some of your early experiences as learnings that you took and sort of built on into your career?
So I was the first woman engineer in my extended family. Being a child, one of the things that my father did was, one thing that he inculcated in me was, whatever you do, you give it your best, and you cannot just be happy with saying, I also ran, right? So that was kind of inculcated in me right from childhood. So when I started my career first with Wipro, the first time they put me on customers, I was in technical customer support, and I was, handling some of the key customers in the west coast of India. And that also required me to travel quite often and being brought up in a very protective environment at home. So one of the things was, would I be even able to do this? But I was game. I am like, no, I'm going to try and do this. There's nothing that's going to stop me. So it started there. And I come from I would say it looks like an era, and I'm feeling really old when I'm saying this. When I started my career, there was no email, pager, mobile, no internet. And that's how, I started my career with technical support. Slowly, as I kind of learned the products, I also wanted to work on the engineering side of things when I then started working on the engineering and the R&D side of projects. I think that's where it started. And I think one of the things that when I look back, is I've always been very curious to learn and never satisfied, right? For me, it was never like, okay, this is done. I never thought that way. For me, I wanted to make my parents proud. And I said, I've done engineering. I got a merit seat. I'm not going to just throw it away like that. And I'm not going to let anything come in the way of building a career. Those days, you are in it, competing with everybody else. There was nothing like coaching formally, things like that. So it was like pretty much you're on your own. But then if you were willing to work hard, opportunities always came your way. And I was in the industry where I think India was being recognized as a big player in the infotech industry. I got all the right opportunities. And I think I've been very fortunate to be part of companies and very significant projects, right? And so that contributed to my learning. And like you said, one of the things that I consciously did was every 3 years, I always looked at, hey, what can I do differently? And I think that change was important for me to keep that excitement and that momentum going. And so that also made me explore new roles. Sometimes I've just gone into it blindly, not knowing what it is, and taken things on. But initially it always used to seem daunting. It was also challenging and exciting. So, and looking back, I don't have any regrets. I've been very proud of how far I have come.
The fact that you said that you just dived into a lot of things is something that I've personally experienced, and as well as the fact that it could be very daunting at the beginning. So I guess I'll ask you this, what do you do to help you overcome the feeling of, being overwhelmed, or when you step into a new role, there's so much unknown. And as a newbie engineer, or as someone who was starting out your career, especially when you say there was no help with respect to technology, like there wasn't the internet to look up things. And I don't know if colleagues were really that helpful to say, hey, I'll step in and, coach you on this or mentor this. So how did you overcome that and make your way or find your way whenever you were in a new role?
I started my career in 1990. And, the first few years, it was, okay, you look up documentation. I know I was living alone in Bangalore, away from home for the first time after college. And I used to spend my Saturdays in office trying to dig around, trying to do some things on my own. And then I never hesitated to ask my senior colleagues for help or ask them to explain something that I didn't understand, because I thought that was a better way of learning than make a mistake, because anything that I did would impact a customer. And I've been on very hot customer calls even in the first 2 years of my career. And so I think I never hesitated to ask. As I took on different roles, one of the things that I would do is I would try to understand the big picture and the context always, because, you take on a role and it's like, okay, what is expected of me? How am I going to add value to this position, and what am I expected to do? I always make sure that I got clarity in some of those, either from my manager or from my teammates. And I think that really helped, Chitra. I would not settle down for not understanding something. I would just pull a teammate and say, okay, let's whiteboard this, let's understand this. And I think that's helped me the most, because even today I do it. I want to learn something. I would just go to an engineer and say, hey, I just want to understand this a little more. Can you help? Some of those have provided me a lot of insights, which I think is very valuable.
So when did you then move on to roles like managing teams and managing people? And what was that transition like for you? Because when you are an engineer on your feet and quickly learning things and asking people, I've always felt that people are more amenable to teach you, to be brainstorming with you, and sort of that camaraderie is there. But when you move into a managerial role, suddenly something shifts, something changes. How did you make that transition, and what was that like for you?
The biggest thing that I experienced when I moved into a manager role was, hey, I'm no longer just responsible for what I do, but responsible for what my team does. And one of the things that I initially struggled with was decision making. I learned at sometimes you make mistakes. I always made sure that, I asked engineers if I had covered everything, is there something that I'm leaving out? And one of the companies that I worked earlier, was very process driven. And we had a separate focus on risk management and risk mitigation. And so that also kind of helped me think along, hey, what is it that could go wrong and how do you mitigate this, right? So I remember some of those lessons even today. So when we have a program risk, the first thing is, okay, how do you mitigate this? And so how do you know that this risk is really going to become a reality? What are those triggers? So I think that was inculcated the way we ran projects. And so when I started managing projects and people, that part definitely helped me, right? But the other thing also was being an engineer, a lot of things was, you want to know everything, but then when you're a manager, there's only so much you can do. So you have to start trusting people around you, right? So that is something that I learned. Not that I was not trusting, but you have to make that extra effort and be self-aware that, hey, you don't want to walk on people's shoes and let them operate in their space, but still hold people accountable for their commitments. And I consciously also had to practice that.
And it's really interesting, something that you just said earlier is that you made it a point to talk to people and learn more about things when you were facing customers directly and handling all these calls with them to largely avoid making mistakes. And when the transition to management happened, you said decision making is a hard thing. And I believe that not only newly minted managers, but very often even seasoned people, it's the hardest thing to do. And yet you land up learning from mistakes. It's a very interesting contrast. I mean, you may have used a lot of tips and techniques and learned a lot of lessons through your career. How is it that people can get comfortable with taking decisions, even when you're not very sure of all the outcomes, and there's no way you can predict all the outcomes, and still be okay with whatever the outcome is of the decision that you take?
So I think, we plan with certain assumptions in mind. And then one of the things that I learned about project management was always plan to replan. Whatever plans you make upfront is never going to stick with you till the end of the project. But you need to be making very conscious assumptions and planning for what is going to happen if this assumption doesn't hold good, right? I started thinking about options. You never have all the answers, right? So, okay, if if this is the situation, then you go towards plan A. If this is plan B. If this scenario, then you go towards plan B. So I think the larger context and the business context is very important. One of the things that I really took away working with customers is, you may be building the greatest product, and and as engineers, we all fall in love with what we create, what our teams create. But it is only good if the customer finds value in it. So it's so important to say, you never reach a perfect solution, but then you say, how do you identify the sweet spot of innovation overlapping with customer benefit? One of the things that I also learned early on when I started managing global charters out of Bangalore, and when I was delivering products for internal customers was, hey, think about what is the user experience. You may have the coolest technology and the coolest product, but if that is not adopted, then it means it doesn't address customer needs. When I was building products with teams, one of the things that I also learned was to consciously take time to do customer listening sessions to understand what is their pain point, right? What is the problem? This was also reinforced in my later years when I started using techniques such as customer-driven innovation to say, what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? What appears as a problem is not what it may actually be. So deep dive into the problem and then look at what is the best possible solution. Then you get adoption, right? So if you have the greatest product, if nobody using it, it doesn't really matter. So that is something that is important, right? What are those use cases? I mean, you may just be delivering maybe a small part of what the customer needs, but the first signs of success of showing the customer that, hey, this is what it will look like, will also help build that trust and confidence in customers. And then you can always kind of iterate because there is no perfect solution, right? What is relevant today may not be relevant tomorrow. learning to live with, hey, this is what it is today, but we are going to make it better and iterate, I think takes away the fear of aiming for perfection, that you might never see in the near future.
That's very interesting. I can relate to that because as engineers and working with a lot of really, really smart engineers, there's this sense of, I wanted to be the perfect product. I wanted to be the best product ever. And like you said, there really isn't a best product. That the bestness of a product, if I may, is really determined by how, like you said, the customer finding value.
Yeah. And also, I think agile development practices, right? Very iterative development, right? You go with something and then you kind of iterate, you get the next better version of the product. So some of the processes that this industry has adopted and what we've done has also helped in fostering that kind of thinking.
Yes. And in fact, I want to come to that question later because, especially in the context of large organizations, how that works is a curiosity question I have. But before we get to that, you talked about some really classic mechanisms to get a pulse or sense the pulse of a customer, like customer listening sessions. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about this customer-driven innovation. Would you be able to share any experience about customer-driven innovation and how, in your experience, it made a difference to the development of the product?
Yeah. So in one of the companies I worked, customer-driven innovation was a way of actually building products. So what it meant is you focus on the problem, right? You don't decide what the solution is. You focus on the problem, making sure that you really understand the customer's problem first, that you're solving what matters to the customer. And then in the process of, after you understand the problem, you say, what is the next best way to solve this problem, right? So you kind of come up with multiple options and then you narrow down and say, okay, probably this is what will suit the customer best. But that is where, what will suit the customer best is driven by the customer benefit than how cool, you are building the product or what technology you're going to use. It's all focused on the customer. That's why it's called customer-driven innovation. And most often we used to do these sessions, let's take a problem statement. Okay, let's look at what are all the different possibilities that the customer is facing these problems, right? Then you start narrowing down. So how do you kind of state the problem statement, right? For example, right, we've done this in one of the, when we were writing an epic, we said, okay, what are we going to get at the end of this epic, right? We say, in the role of, say, cloud engineer, need to do operation XXX, but I am so frustrated with the way I am having to manage these operations that it has to be much better, simpler, faster by twice the reduction in cycle time or lesser effort or things like that. So you start having a template in which are you able to articulate the customer's problem? When I say customer, it could also be the persona.
Yeah.
Right? Who are you solving this for? So once you kind of create that problem statement, then you say, okay, so this is the problem and I'm expected to solve it to derive this outcome. Then you start looking at what are the different ways in how you want to solve this problem. What could be the possible outcomes, but what is the outcome that will best fit the customer, right? And so that's how you find that sweet spot of innovation and customer benefit.
Nice, Cynthia. In fact, even though it may have been an example, what I've also begun to appreciate and also see in your response is the fact that you are actually trying to put in a customer emotion there. What is their real pain? And I think that gives a lot more impact to requirements. In this case, whether they, epics translate to stories and further down, but it also is a reflection of how requirements gathering has changed. I mean, if you recall, the earlier technical requirements document or the requirement specifications would rarely incorporate a customer's emotion behind what is really hindering them or frustrating them about not being able to do their jobs, right? And today, as in the form of epics and stories, you can actually capture that and reflect that and probably play it back to an engineering team, right?
Yes. In fact, when we size stories, we always try to look at that aspect. And that's where you kind of break down the problem, right? How do you solve problems one at a time, and how do you do it iteratively?
This goes back to the question that I wanted to ask you. And you said, the agile methodologies and iterative development have given product teams a kind of agility to respond to customer needs and evolve a product or build a better product. How does that really work in the context of large organizations? You have, based on my experience, organizations are sort of going through this elastic change. Sometimes you grow and then you shrink and then you hive off fractals of an organization. All kinds of things are tried. How has this worked or not approach of iterative development for large organizations?
I think even if the organizations are large, Chitra, I think you kind of have smaller scrum teams, and you need to kind of empower those scrum teams to say, hey, you own the deliverable. So you decide how you are going to write your user stories and what are you going to showcase at the end of that particular sprint, right? I think empowering teams to do this, ensuring that you train people, it's more of also the mindset. I think the mindset, the training, it's a culture change is what I would say. People kind of start liking it when they see that they are able to start delivering product incrementally. I have been successful driving it from the top, when I set some of those development processes, celebrating some of those achievements, right? And you deliver something at the end of a sprint. Yes, it's of value to the customer. So let's go celebrate. These are small celebrations, which also reinforces that, hey, it's working and it keeps the teams motivated. So in large organizations, I would actually think the other way, because in larger organizations that I have worked in, I think process plays a big role. And so somewhere I think it's easier to kind of index some of those processes and drive them. I have never been able to do that effectively in startups, right? So that again comes back to the velocity, the pace at which these organizations operate, what matters. I have seen it work in large organizations, provided we are able to train people. I've also worked at an established, I wouldn't say startup, but the momentum, the pace, great opportunity, role that I enjoyed. But things are just so fast, right? I mean, you just have to react to customers globally. I didn't think this was an opportunity because of the multiple dependencies that we had. So it worked in some areas, it didn't work elsewhere.
Yeah, so that was an interesting contrast in what I thought would actually be the contrary, the reverse situation. But yes, I think in also very fast changing environments, for whatever reason, whether it's a startup or it's just the mode of operation of a certain organization, I think moving from reaction to measured response is also, some sort of a mindset, like you say. And it kind of leads me to my next question. You've played so many roles through the years with so many different types of organizations that you've worked with. You've led large teams through transformations, which are typically quite hard to do, because there is that natural resistance that all of us have. At the end of the day, we're all people, we're all humans. And yet everyone appears to understand the need or the rationale for it, but yet it's fraught with so many challenges. So what have been some of your experiences leading organizations or enterprise level organizations through these kind of transformations, and what have been some of your takeaways from it?
Transformations are hard. And I have had to lead some of these, especially when I joined as a new leader. As such, when you're a new leader, people are looking at, okay, what is she going to come and do, right? What I have experienced is that first, I need to convince myself that this change is the right thing to do, because I believe that as a leader, I need to be able to stand in front of an organization and without blinking, I need to be able to say, hey, this is why we need to do something. It is important to share that vision and the end state of why we need to do something and take people along with me, right? That was very important. Because at the end of the day, it's a question of trust and credibility that I have had to build with teams, right? And that doesn't come easily unless, I am being honest I'm going to be invested in the team, and then I can expect them to kind of walk with me, right? And so for me, transformations are hard, but then transformations can be done seamlessly if you focus on the people connections first. How do you motivate people? What's in it for them? There will be resistance to change, but then how do you overcome this resistance? Because people are kind of thinking, what's in it for me, right? Will I even keep my job, right? But then it's important to that some of these transformations are required just to stay relevant in the industry, right? And I think you, as a leader, I've been able to kind of stand in front of my teams and explain that to them and said, I have your back and I am with you on this journey. It's a journey. Nothing is going to change overnight. So I think that motivation is very important, because I think when you do that, people are going to want to stay and work and be on the journey with you. And nobody is going to do this just because, you pay them more. And that's a lesson that I have learned time and again as, I have made some of these changes. And I've also made it a point to share some of those success stories with teams to say, hey, this is what it was, a year ago, and this is how far we've come. So people have built that conviction in teams is very important. But at the same time, one of the things that is important is also to make sure that while transformation leads to change, I think the framework that will guide us through these changes is the values and principles with acceptable and expected behaviors, which is the foundation of the culture of the organization. It all has to happen within that cultural framework. In the course of that journey, while I was trying to accomplish transformation is going to be done in, say, 3 to 5 years, it was important to keep the people aspect and make sure that people also felt that they were winning too, that they were developing, that they learned. Then it becomes a win-win. I think establishing that trust and relationships is very important to drive action. And always when the transformation starts, it's never going to be easy. And I have always not shied away from admitting when things are not going great, being very transparent. And it's also establishing that common purpose and vision. Because, one of the things I truly believe is nobody wants to do a bad job. So therefore, as a leader, it is important to think about how are you going to get your people on board? What role do they play? I think that has been the single biggest factor in driving change and transformation, Chitra.
That's very nicely put, Cynthia. In fact, I think it's so empowering when you said people need to feel like they're winning, they're developing, and they're learning. So it's like we're all part of this transformation together. Knowing you as such a seasoned leader, I sort of had to ask that question. So I wanted to go back and talk to you a little bit about what it's been like working with global teams. And every person I've noticed has had their own experience when you suddenly have to start working with teams across the world. Like you said earlier, it can get daunting. And suddenly there's so much more to be done, right from establishing that connect, that relationship, and then actually getting work done. It can take quite an effort. And sometimes you feel like it's not going anywhere at all before it begins to go, nicely and smoothly. So based on your experiences, and I'm sure you have a wealth of them, what is it that you could share with people who take on these kind of global roles and perhaps even global leadership roles?
So, I'm just reminded of the global charter that I was driving out of Bangalore, where I had teams even in the US reporting into me from multiple locations. For me, it was no different than managing my teams locally in Bangalore. And that was an aha moment because, though it's a different culture, different time zone, of course, it required me to stretch, but people are the same. I mean, you have to invest in people no matter what. And people need to know that they are valued. I think when you trust people to do something and you truly empower them, I think teams will deliver, right? This is in my capacity as a manager who is leading teams. Now, over the course of my experience across multiple companies in leadership roles, one of the is establishing that trust and relationships is extremely important. And so whenever I have taken on a new role, again, it's new peers, new stakeholders. I have always tried to establish that connect to understand, how much can I learn from them? I have been shameless in asking, please tell me, what should I know? Right? Who should I go to? Right? I mean, this is something, what am I missing? Is my understanding right? I think it's important to get these. And, I should say, I think I have had great peers, always been willing to help. I think you just need to ask, not shy away from asking, because I think they also want to make sure that, hey, you understand the bigger picture, and it's collective success, right? I mean, if I fail, I know it's going to be a collective failure. And if I don't drive the right things, it's not going to work either. So I think people are always willing to help, but it's also important that whenever I was new to an ecosystem, the onus was on me to establish those connects, try to understand more, keep asking for information, keep reading up, ask people locally if I don't understand something. I think that stakeholder connect, checking in and periodically connecting with people, both in a formal setting as well as, when you travel, understand what people like, what are your areas of interest. I believe human beings are the same everywhere, irrespective of culture, nationality. And I think it's important to build that connect. And I can tell you from my experience, I onboarded 2 times. I've changed companies during this COVID time. And you can imagine how difficult it must have been to virtually onboard. But I surprised myself, and I was able to kind of meet with people, take on the role, start driving things. So then, it's again a reinforcement that what matters is you are anyway remote, but so it's all the more important to establish the trust.
Yeah, in fact, how did you manage it during these 2 very, very difficult years?
It's been very tough. It's been long days, physically tiring, mentally exhausting. As a person, I'm somebody who takes on something and I don't give up. The other thing is that when you're in a leadership role, it's not just a sense of personal accomplishment. It's also that you're representing a large team. And as a leader, I know that I'm representing my team. So if I'm not getting it right, then, it's going to impact them. So there's always this healthy pressure, if I might call it.
Although, these 2 years, I think, turned every funda on its head. I'm wondering if you're just being the person you are, who's really strong and, committed to do the right thing. Even then, it must have taken quite some toll to actually get things going. Yeah,
it did, because I'm the kind of person who will just walk across to an engineer's seat and then sit with the person and understand what's going on just across the table. So here, being in a newer environment and trying to get everything over a meeting definitely was more time consuming. So much of virtual screen time. I'm just hoping that phase is going to come to an end soon.
Yeah, certainly. I think there are many people who are hoping, including myself, that although we have started in-person work for several weeks now, and we can definitely see the difference. Wonder what will come next that will have to change our ways of working. I noticed that we're sort of coming to the end of this conversation. I always ask my guests, what messages would they like to leave for people aspiring to have a career in technology and engineering?
I think being in this industry for more than 3 decades, I have witnessed technology revolutions or disruptions, as you might call it. Having come into this industry at a time when there was no internet, no mobile, no email, and then, we've seen the internet explode, and then cloud, big data, mobile, and now, the world of augmented and virtual reality, AI, ML. The one takeaway for me is, which I would kind of be happy to pass on, is anticipate change and be ready to adapt. Change is the only constant. It's not just important to learn, but also unlearn, because what is relevant today may not be relevant tomorrow. And while you are doing what you do best today, be curious and be passionate at what you do, right? I mean, those are the thoughts that I will leave someone with if they want a career in technology.
Thanks, Cynthia. Very relevant, I would say, especially from the adaptability and ready to face change perspective. Just given all that's happened, This was a really interesting conversation. There are so many more questions, and I hope at some point in time we can dive deep into certain areas. I will look forward to another conversation, but until then, it was really nice talking to you and having you on this show. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chitra. The pleasure was mine. Appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. Thank you for the opportunity.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People Stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.